I'm delighted to invite up Peter Schwarzenbauer, board member of BMW Group, in charge of Mini, Rolls-Royce, and Motorrad, the motorcycle division. Peter, please, we'll grab a seat down here. So Peter and I were meeting beforehand. And I'd drawn out a whole list of questions I had for him. And Peter insisted with starting with a very different question. Instead of talking about the technology, instead of talking about the nuts and bolts, let's start with the question of what does it all mean? What does it all mean if we achieve the vision that's being laid out here? Which raises a great question because, what does it mean from the perspective of the BMW Group to be part of this vision, this world that we will build that is decarbonized, that is equitable, that is sustainable, that all these things. So I guess as an opening question, what does it mean for you to be here at LA CoMotion and to actually build this world and how BMW plays a role in it?
Yeah, I think I wanted to touch this question because, I am quite often in events all over the world talking about the technology. And a lot of people are using many buzzwords around this technology, autonomous driving, and you name it. But at the end of the day, what I'm missing in this public discussion is, what does this all mean for all of us? We are so deep into the details of saying how could it work and is this technology better this way or that way? What's the regulation, safety, health issues and all this, which are all important questions, don't get me wrong, but in my eyes, we sometimes don't discuss enough what at the end of the day does it mean. And I think that if I look at autonomous driving, and we are investing since some years now billions of dollars into this technology, and of course if you as a company you invest so much money in a new technology, you start to have a lot of discussion around this. What does it actually mean long term? And if I look at big cities like LA or many others around the world with very similar challenges, I personally think that autonomous driving, and we talk about robots, are really going to be a revolution when it comes to how we all organize our mobility. And if you talk about mobility, another point which is also important to me always is, and all the research, at least I know, shows that being mobile is something which is almost probably in our DNA. We want to be mobile. We want to make our own decisions to go from A to B. And this will, in the future, even increase. You have to imagine we have right now per year, we travel around about 10 trillion miles, 10 trillion miles per year privately. This will go up to 15 million in the next 10 years. So there's a huge demand for mobility in the upcoming years. And the question is, how do we all organize this mobility? And this is why I think autonomous driving is or has the capacity of being a real revolution. Imagine now Los Angeles in, 2035, 2040, and you have full autonomous driving everywhere. I think that you will not see any more cars parked on streets, which are now taking away a lot of space. We will not need any more car parkings. We can use them to build affordable homes, which is one of the major pain points in all the cities around the world. Imagine all the traffic lights, all the signage. Everything will go away because the system will be so well organized and so smart that we don't need all this anymore. So we are going into a future with zero accident, zero pollution, and with much more space which we can convert in things we would like to convert them, green area or housing, what I mentioned before. And I think sometimes when we discuss all the problems which we are going to face towards this future, we are not enough focused on where we are going, because I think we could overcome a lot of the issues if we would have all this extremely positive future I can see with this technology.
All right, well, setting aside autonomous vehicles for a moment, there's a great premise we could debate all day in here. It'd be interesting about the people who believe that it's inherently good to move. I would be on that camp. There's a lot of people who argue that we need to move less, or the question of how to move. But what I really focus in on is, of course, and Phil Washington, who was on stage earlier today from LA Metro, was saying that, the automakers collectively have spent decades and billions selling us a narrative of mobility. And it was private, it was the car, the ultimate driving machine, power, freedom, this entire narrative about it. And so I have a thought exercise for you. If you had the complete marketing resources of the group behind you, what would be the ultimate mobility experience in the sense of how would you sell that narratively, emotionally? We all, I think, agree in this room on the benefits of this. It's just undoing the narrative that we constructed, and how would you think about going about creating that new narrative for that if you pivoted completely to that future and selling those benefits?
I think, and this is now a thesis I have. I cannot prove it, but I say it anyway. What my notion is right now is the more our world gets virtual, augmented reality, you name it, the more we humans have the need to meet in person. And as long as we cannot beam ourselves, we will need some kind of technology to move us from A to B. And I'm not saying what's the best technology is, but these two theses are coming together. So the need to really want to meet each other, and the technology which is in our hands to make it happen in a much more seamless, much less painless, basically, because now commuting is pain for most people, and in a sustainable way. So if it's seamless, sustainable, and even enjoyable, because all of a sudden you gain time when you are in a car, I think this would be the narrative.
Interesting. So I found it fascinating with Mini here. With Mini as one of our partners, that all of the other partners here, scooter companies, everyone else, have rows of vehicles out on our test track. Mini didn't bring a car. You brought a house. And I'm curious if you could talk a bit about that, because I think when most people still think of Mini this day, they think of the Italian job and cute cars. But obviously with Mini Living launching in Shanghai, a co-living, co-working mobility as a service play, the definition of Mini is expanding. I hope you could talk a bit about that, because it sort of perhaps offers a blueprint of how the OEMs, with their gigantic revenues and brand equity, could expand into various areas that don't require selling SUVs necessarily.
Yeah, I think we, in the Mini brand, we started about 4 years ago to look at what is the overall more holistic view on cities. Because Mini is a very urban brand. 80% of our cars are sold in an urban environment. So we basically sat down with a small group of people and said, what does it mean for us? And not just on mobility. What is life in urban environments around the world really means? Where are the pain points? And then besides the one we touched already on the mobility side, you very quickly come also to this topic that living conditions, affordable housing, especially for our target group at Mini, which are mainly younger people, is a huge pain point in almost every city around the world. So Mini was created in 1959 with the DNA of creative use of space. Because back then there was an oil crisis, so somebody came up, a crazy engineer in Great Britain, saying, I'm going to build something completely new on a very small footprint, but with a lot of interior space. So we thought, couldn't we transfer this creative use of space to more things than not only the car? Because I also personally think that big corporations like ours, we have more responsibility than just putting nice products into the market. And this is where we started to work on the mini living concept, and we brought one example here today, the cabin. And we built it up over the years, so we just did not go out like a marketing theme and say, oh, we are doing now living. We built it up with a lot of architects around the world and saying, how can we transform smaller spaces into areas where people really feel comfortable? And you mentioned it, bringing also together live, work, play into one space, which also reduces, by the way, mobility, because you have everything in one place. So we took a very holistic view on what's going on in cities around the world. And living is one thing. We have our Urban X Accelerator in Brooklyn, which we also started some years ago, where we are not just taking any startup, we are basically focusing on startups which are doing something to improve the quality of life in major cities. So it's a holistic approach which we took in Mini, and it goes far beyond just cars.
It is ironic. I just thought of this, that a maker of the world's most private spaces inside of a car is now building semi-public-ish housing prototypes. Earlier on stage today, Selita Reynolds, the GM of LADOT, said adamantly people must drive less in Los Angeles and presumably worldwide. But she also conceded that automakers had a big role to play in the public-private sector in making this happen. And that's been one of the themes here, is this sort of tension or various approaches by private companies trying to work with cities. And we've seen several automakers. We just had an executive from Moya, which is Volkswagen Group's here, and there's several others. I know you can't talk too much about it because the regulatory hurdles have not been cleared, but Daimler and BMW are combining their sort of new mobility arms in a new joint venture. And I'm sort of curious how you see that group working with cities in terms of what kind of proposition. Will it be sort of, turnkey, we have the suite of services, we'll help install this infrastructure? Will it be consulting? I'm curious if you can hint at what that combined vision will be and how it will approach working with the public sector.
Yeah, first of all, I'm convinced that if we talk about mobility in a major city like LA, no one can resolve it on their own. So with what I always called in the past too much silo thinking. So you have the individual mobility, you have the public transportation and so on, and then we have city planners, and everybody worked in their own silos. I think these times are over. If we want to resolve it, it's only together. Our possible joint venture with Daimler, we are really putting all our knowledge and know-how in the mobility service area. It goes from parking, charging, car sharing, ride sharing, and also intermodal driving together, because we think this can help to scale quicker, and actually also it can help cities to organize mobility much better. So the idea is really not to tell people what to do. It's more about an offer where if you want to or need to travel from A to B, we are going to offer, depending on the time of the day, the weather conditions, the traffic conditions, we are going to offer you the best option of getting from A to B. And this could include bicycle, micro-mobility, which we see some exciting things here outside display, and public transportation, everything. If we don't interconnect all these mobilities which we have available today, we are not going to resolve it. So that's the idea behind the joint venture.
In that vein, I was curious about how you see the product types being offered by Mini and the BMW Group evolving. So I've been taken by, speaking of the scooters, I've been taken by the interesting notion, and you've said in the past, that one of the group's big strengths, of course, is unparalleled supply chain manufacturing expertise, decades of experience in this. And those of you who've read Innovator's Dilemma would look at the scooters and say, this is something that fits the classic disruptive paradigm, unlike many things, but in the sense of it's cheap, it's created a market that didn't exist before, it's coming out of this Chinese electronic manufacturer stack, it's a whole other sort of kettle of fish. And I'm curious, sitting on the board of one of the world's largest OEMs yeah, I mean, how paranoid are you about the scooter? I mean, Ford just bought Spin, for example, and is absorbing it in, and GM just rolled out its own design. I was going to ask what a mini scooter looks like, but you told me beforehand you already have one. It's just not branded Mini. But I'm curious if you're thinking about how the group has to evolve into these other areas. I mean, whether it's acquisition or designing its own products, or how you respond to that challenge.
Yeah, I think it has to do with what I mentioned before. We have to look at the entire mobility chain. I think just to take out now one and say, oh, the scooter, only because now it's a lot of hype around it, is the solution. It's a very tiny part of the solution, an important part, but it's a tiny part. And in my eyes, it only will work over time if it's part of a mobility chain. Just the little micro-mobility alone again, what I said before, if you take it as a silo, I don't think it will survive if it's not part of a bigger thing. So yes, we in our group, we have a scooter. It's technology-wise from a scooter compared to one of our other products. It's not so complicated on a technology point of view. So we have one. It's not branded Mini. We'll have to think about if it makes sense. But technology-wise, we have it available.
A last question at the other end of the spectrum, and this gets back to almost sort of the marketing and the vision for this. Of course, we have electric cars out there. We're all very excited about EVs. I saw and I read, and tell me if this is true, I saw on Twitter that BMW is now referring to its internal combustion engine cars as classic cars as it moves towards electrification. But how do we continue to sell people on the vision of EVs? Because in the United States, car ownership is rising. Someone noted earlier that Ford has abandoned sedans because basically people want trucks and SUVs. So at the same time, the companies like BMW are promoting this urban vision and promoting this vision of electrification. In the United States, people want gigantic cars and trucks. And so I'm curious how much agency you feel in terms of promoting a vision versus having to respond to your customers in the near term and not being able to make those longer term investments because you must have SUVs to sell because that's what the market wants right this moment.
I think if we want to be successful with the EV transformation, we still have to work more on taking away, from a consumer point of view, seeing a lot of pain points. There's still a question about, is the range enough? Even if we all know, meanwhile, the average person, and I looked it up, even in LA, it's about 40 miles per day. So it's not much. So if you offer 100 miles, people already say, no, that's not enough, and you have range anxiety. So we definitely have to work on the technology side on extending this range. The other topic is, of course, how does this whole charging work? And I think we, at least this is our point of view, we started a company 3 years ago which is called Energy Services. And as I said before, we took a very holistic view on this whole thing to make EV driving totally seamless. It should be almost, we are thinking in a direction where we say, if you buy one of the EVs, basically power energy is for free. So the driving cost is zero on this cars. And if you still then afterwards do a first test drive, I think this is another topic where we probably have to invest more money to get people in the cars to try it out. I have not seen one person yet who came out of an EV and said, oh, that's boring. It's highly emotional. And I think that's probably the thing which we have to work on. On the emotional side, get more and more people into driving EVs. And on the pain side, take away the range, take away the charging, take away all the questions consumers have around EVs.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I like to say that LA CoMotion is basically the auto show for everything that's not autos. So it's great to have you here. Thank you for joining us, Peter. May I get a round of applause for Peter Schwarzenbauer, please? Thank you.